welcome everyone to this Katu talk. It's titled The Secret Revolution. Earlier we had a title of Revolution, Counter-Revolution. It both sort of plays into it, but we're looking at organised labour in Ireland from 1908 to the end of the Civil War. First we're going to start off with a question. Why is working class history, or history in general even, important for organisers and activists?
Say just doing the same thing over and over again. Like if we have a particular strategy that we come up with in a meeting that we think might work, but then we can go back and see, well, for these reasons it didn't work. If the conditions are similar, then we can kind of fairly accurately assume that we're going to run into the same problems.
Yeah. Anyone else?
Yeah. So it's just helpful to be able to see that it can be done.
Yeah, that's even like I'm studying this period for my dissertation, and I don't know, like every time I research it, I'm like, wow, how did this happen? Anyone else? Yeah.
Seeing that average people are also important in history, not just leaders, politicians, kings and queens. So placing ourselves in the centre of history.
Yeah, absolutely. That kind of leads pretty well into sort of point I wanted to make on this in general, was that like history we're often taught to believe through school and through just the way it's talked about in life, and the way that a lot of history books are written, is that it's just sort of this collection of facts and stories that it's just kind of like a neutral collection of what happened to who and when in fact it's fundamentally it is the story of human struggle, and more specifically the struggle for liberation in a broad sense, equality and justice, and also the stories of sort of the forces that are against that. So we'll be discussing that quite a bit in this talk. Obviously, this is just one part of a wider history of Ireland and the working class movement globally. But we're looking really at the most turbulent years in Irish history, really. And obviously to the backdrop of British colonialism and capitalism, which is the economic system that we still live in. We all know that as tenants. It's not a completed story. We in CATU, or through trade unions, or through campaigns, are all part of this living history that is still going on today. It's easy to sort of think of this history as a long time ago, the book is closed kind of thing, but it's not. And hopefully I'll be able to show that through this. So what history actually offers for us as organisers and activists is partly, as Stephen said, a sort of a guide to how things have been done in the past, what worked and what failed, so that we can learn from it and win, basically, at the end of the day. It's also just very inspiring, I think, especially looking at this period in Irish history of, as Fiacre was saying, and I think Evan as well, this sort of inspiring story of what can be done when people organise collectively. I put in a little quote here by a certain German philosopher called Karl Marx, but I think it sort of gets to it, really. So history does nothing, it possesses no immense wealth, it wages no battles, it is man, or human, maybe, real living man who does all that, who possesses and fights history, is not, as it were, a person apart, using man as a means to achieve its own aims. History is nothing but the activity of man pursuing his aims. So, struggle, basically. So just in terms of the basic sort of background of this period, it's a very familiar period. Most of us learn it in school, but we don't learn the sort of radical working class element of that. So I guess who here has heard of the Dublin lockout? Yeah, I think it's on the syllabus. Who's heard of the Cork lockout, 1909? Who's heard of the Limerick Soviet? Yeah, I'm actually not sure if that's in the Soviets or not, but who here has heard of the Cork Harbour Soviet?
Yeah, actually.
The Munster Soviet. Okay. Proving my point.
Well, really embarrassing.
We'll just stop the talk there. So yeah, obviously we're looking at a point in time where Ireland was completely occupied by Britain. This obviously affects all aspects of social, economic, political life. You know, from the economic structure of the economy of the island to the cultural expression, such as the Irish language or you know, sports and stuff like that. One of the most important effects of that for us in this talk is that the Irish trade union movement was really sort of an appendage of the British trade union movement. So even within Ireland, unions wouldn't have like a national structure, so they'd have to go to Britain and speak to trade unionists in Britain to sort of appeal for their own interests to be looked after. In general, the workforce was overwhelmingly ununionized or unorganized, especially in the unskilled workers. So sort of talking about dockers, sort of unspecialized labor like farm laborers and stuff like that. So yeah, there were 800,000 unskilled workers and only 50,000 were organized. We also have this period of sort of deindustrialization and industrialization at the same time in the south. So basically most of the country, there had been a limited sort of industrial base there. In the early, or the sort of late years of the 1800s and early 1900s, that kind of collapses. And what ends up happening is the industry in Ireland is focused into the northeast, especially in Belfast. So in 1914, at the start of the war, 42% of Ireland's industrial workforce was in Belfast, so it was like massively unbalanced. That obviously has a massive effect on the livelihoods of people in Ireland. Employment wasn't as plentiful as it was in the north. There are massive workplaces, and this sort of feeds into the trend of emigration and depopulation that had happened since the famine, really. So since the famine, the population of the island had declined by 50%, leaving especially massive parts of rural Ireland effectively empty, which enabled larger estates to be made and have these massive ranches. So the concentration of wealth and property into smaller hands was talked about a lot in Faircre's talk on the War on Landlords, which is a great title. This also led to people moving from Ireland to places like Britain and America as cheap labour. There is also a massive issue with slum landlordism in urban centres, especially places like Dublin, which sort of known as having the largest slums in Western Europe at that time, which led to massive problems with you know, disease and just the danger of these decaying massive buildings. Yeah, so all of this basically led to a shit quality of life for most people in Ireland. Stagnant wages because industry wasn't growing, and because workers weren't organised primarily, and awful workplace conditions as well. Another sort of facet to this, which sort of builds off Fikra's talk again, is there was this sort of history and tradition of struggle within Ireland. So you had stuff like the Land War. You also had anti-colonial uprisings like the United Irishmen in 1798, then the Fenians in 1848 and 67. Thank you. And importantly as well, this wasn't just a history to people; it was a living memory for a lot of people. Many people, for example, would have been involved in the Land War and still living to see the consequences of it. Of course, the Land War didn't really end. If you look at the broader scope of it until the 1920s anyway. And then obviously can't talk about this period without talking about the wave of revolt and revolution and struggles of national liberation that erupted across Europe and the world in this period. And yeah, I won't spoil. So yeah, here are just pictures. We've got up on the left a very famous picture of workers enjoying lunch while building a skyscraper in New York. We actually know that they're all Irish workers. On the right here, we have a scene from the land war of, I think it's tenants burning, the scope of it until the 1920s anyway. And then rental contracts on their landlord's estate. And then the bottom here, we have Dublin Castle, the centre of British administration in Ireland, rental contracts. We're going to start off with 1909. Here you see a scene from the 1913 lockout, but I won't jump ahead too much. So yeah, into this sort of situation of a mass unorganised workforce, you sort of have to wonder, why was this? And the main reason really was the sort of idea of a trade union at this point was very much more akin to like a guild than the sort of trade unions that we'd be more familiar with today. And without going too much into it, that sort of movement was called the New Model Union. It emphasised on organising skilled workers. They didn't really go on strike. They wanted to keep this friendly relationship between the employers and the employees. And obviously, at this point, a lot of workplaces, especially in the South, would have been very small, so there would have been a very personal relationship between the employer and employee. They also sort of functioned as a way of keeping control over apprenticeships, which allowed them to sort of artificially keep their wages higher than employers wanted to set for them. So from the sort of 1890s on, a new sort of perspective on trade unions came in that was focused much more on the unskilled workers, which made up most of the the population of workers. Characterized by militancy, by mass organisation and mass strikes. And it's from 1809 really that we see the first iteration of that in Ireland, which is in the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. I'll just call it the Transport Union, or the union, because this is really the organisation that we'll be looking at mostly today. It's a really fascinating example of a trade union. Initially, it was a breakaway from a more moderate British-based dock workers union. But on the right here, we see James Larkin, who is really the sort of driving force behind the founding of the union. In terms of what made this union different, like even among the new wave of trade unions, the transport union was sort of exceptional within the background to which it emerged. So it was sort of organized around the principles of something called syndicalism. We don't really have to go too much into it, but as you can see there, one scholar referred to it more of a mentality than a movement. So a vibe, maybe, is what we call it. The idea behind syndicalism was basically that trade unions would eventually be able to organize enough of the workplace that they could go on massive strikes, take over workplaces, and overthrow capitalism that way. So that was sort of the sort of thrust of it. But other aspects of that would be, we've got the badge of the union up here. Does anyone know what OBU stands for?
One big union.
One big union, yeah. So that's the idea that whereas in the past unions would be organized around trades, very like specifically, you know, the tailors would have their trade union, etc. The sort of syndicalist approach was to have a single union to organize the mass of workers. Sort of a very simple idea, but arguably the ITGW were the most sort of successful advocates of that in a country. And there was also the idea of mass recruitment, so recruiting everyone you can from every workplace. They were far less hesitant to go straight to strike compared to the older unions. And also the idea of the sympathetic strike, which is something that James Larkin really made into like almost a personal mantra. But you know, if the dock workers go on strike, then the train workers will also go on strike in sympathy to sort of ratchet up the tension. But that also played the role of increasing the confidence of workers, and sort of also thought of a way of kind of training for the massive strike that would overthrow capitalism. So that's the kind of gist of it. This is sort of almost personally through Larkin the idea of propaganda and agitation. Trade unions had sort of always had their own sort of like bulletins and stuff like that for members, but the transport union sort of took that to a new level of sort of mass distribution of working class journalism and reporting and agitational articles. So the transport union has this sort of baptism of fire through what's called a Cork lockout. A lockout, does anyone know what a lockout is? Yeah.
It's where workers are literally locked out of their premises by their employer.
This is like a very early chaotic test for the transport union, which was still very small at the time.
I just on the lockout thing, I had a question about it because it's something that I've heard about before, but I'm actually not sure about what the logic is on the employer's part in locking out workers.
It's basically because of the sympathetic strike, the strikes would be spreading across the city. So the employers would get together in their own union, which they were always quick to organise, much quicker than workers. And sort of happens in the Cork lockout and also in the Dublin one. The employers present an ultimatum to workers to leave the union and promise never to join the union again, or be blacklisted. So it's kind of collective action on the part of the employers to break the union, basically, not just to break the strike, but to completely destroy the union. So sort of leading up to the lockout from November to May, there are strikes by the coal porters on the docks in Cork, with some modest wins, but this sort of led to an increase in militancy among workers and sort of an increase of confidence. And yeah, then tram workers and construction workers strike as well. So there's this very sort of fertile atmosphere in the city for strike action. And then the Cork Employers Federation was founded, which is a trade union but for employers. This is the first organisation of its type in Ireland, so we can be very proud of that in Cork. Yeah, it essentially recruits 400 employers from Cork, which is obviously a massive amount. Did you have a question?
There is one in Belfast in 1907.
Ah, fuck.
During the dock strike, there's.
Oh, okay, yeah. I decided to go after that. Yeah, okay, whatever. That's my excuse. I mentioned that it was a very chaotic early test for the transport union, primarily because these workers hadn't really participated in strike action before. The union was literally just a few months old, and Larkin was the only real organiser, and he had been zipping up and down the country. So eventually he comes down to Cork to organise the strike. We're in the coal porters strike for an increase of wages. They actually striked at the employment of workers in a union that was known to be a scab union, so a union that employers would bring in to work when other workers were on strike to undermine their strike. So they go out on strike. This expands from the sort of the docks. So this would have been on the Morrison's Quay. Is that
Morrison's Quay opposite School of Music?
Yeah, that sort of area. So, but that expands gradually from those docks to include porters, the carmen, the storemen, across just the coal industry at first, and then spreads even wider to railway workers, flour millers, and even more. So in total, there was about 2,000 people out on strike around this time. The Employers Federation sort of gets its shit together and enforces a lockout. So as you were saying, that meant that you're not really on strike if your place of employment is shut down. But they also they in terms of like the lockout physically that happened, but also there was a lockout in terms of negotiating with the union as well. So the aim really was to just destroy the union no matter what happens to the workers. So very benevolent employers, obviously. And then eventually scab workers are also shipped in from England through something that was called the Shipping Federation, which is sort of like this, like between Britain and Ireland, this organisation made by the shipping company owners to bring scabs from one port to the next to break strikes. And the Employers Federation gives this ultimatum that I mentioned before to the workers of either leave the union or never get a job with us again. And of course, they represent 400 employers across the city, so it was a very real threat for people. Sort of another aspect of this is that, like I mentioned, that it was a very young union, very disorganised strike. James Larkin would later claim that the Irish Citizens' Army was founded in Cork in spirit in 1909. That's not really true. There were sort of clashes between police and striking workers and scabs, but it was never really organised, and they were more sort of like street brawls than anything else. But the end of the day, the Employers Federation wins. The transport union branch in the city collapses because it's a massive loss for such a young union. And it was only really until 1913 that the branch in Cork City recovered. So from this sort of very early test, we see that the transport union grows massively. Yeah, you see there, from 1909 to 1913, the membership exploded from a low of 1,200 to 30,000, and that just kind of keeps going over this period. By 1921, I think they were claiming 100,000 members, which was much bigger than most unions in Britain even. So the sort of idea of the one big union was very much taken to heart. During 1910, there was also the founding of the Irish Women Workers' Union. Initially, they're sort of separate unions. These people were radical for their time, but there were still obviously these patriarchal attitudes towards women. Eventually, the Women Workers' Union gets sort of folded into the union in general. There's also.
Do you think that the folding of the women's union into the general union is a good thing or a bad thing?
I don't think it's that important. They were sort of like the like leadership of the Women's Workers Union was like appointed by the executive of the transport union, so it was sort of like still kept at arm's length. But yeah, when it was brought in, it was made much more democratic and equal. So during this sort of period of 1909, 1911, there is this massive sort of unrest. So the transport union starts organising within the countryside as well, so within agricultural labourers. And these people had sort of been sort of very inactive since the heights of the land war. So we're sort of injecting new energy into a class of people that were already very experienced with this kind of activism and work. In 1911, there is something called the Great Transport Workers' Strike. This is sort of focused in England and in Liverpool, but because of the transport union's ideas of the sympathy strike, they sort of expand the strike to basically all the ports. This also triggers the Wexford lockout, which is another example of that. That's also broken by the Shipping Federation bringing in scabs. But over the course of the sort of the period of the Great Transport Workers' Strike, between Britain and Ireland, they're able to sort of break the power of the Shipping Federation. So massive win for the unions. This was also when the bosses unionised in Dublin as well. So the Dublin Employers Federation is set up, which will become much more prominent in the next few slides. But it was set up by William Martin Murphy, who becomes a very infamous figure later on, who he owned the tramways in Dublin, and also owned other tramways and train lines across the British Empire. And he owned the Irish Independent and a few other smaller newspapers. Through this period, with the massive success behind him, Larkin, who was always a bit of a hothead and a egocentric guy, it sort of all goes to his head. There's in his own newspaper, which he edited, the Irish Worker, he's sort of like consistently referred to as like the chief and the one and only. So yeah, it's not the best thing to be passing through your own editorial. He also starts sort of building up this very personal rivalry with William Martin Murphy. At one point, he said that Larkin is prepared to meet you face to face on any platform and prove you're a poltroon, liar, and sweater. So this wasn't really about building the union anymore. He was very much like personally involved in this kind of tit for tat kind of rivalry.
It's a poultry.
I have no idea. I imagine it's not something very nice. So this leads us into the much more well-known Dublin lockout, but still, I think before the centenary in 2013, a lot of people probably hadn't heard of it outside of labour historians and trade unionists. So, obviously, in the way that we do learn about it in a very limited way, this is sort of the only lockout we're told about, but we know that this is part of a series of lockouts across the last couple of years. It was also sort of side by side with the personal rivalry between Larkin and Murphy. You had like the efforts of the union were actually very impressive. Larkin boasted, probably not too exaggerating, but he boasted saying that Dublin was the most well-unionised city in the world, which is not. It's not impossible at that time. Like I said, the efforts of the union were working. In the build-up to this, there was also this very big idea within the union of all these successes behind their back, that there was this sort of historical purpose that they were serving. They hadn't really faced a massive failure since the Cork lockout, so there was massive confidence behind the union. So what triggered it initially was that William Martin Murphy, who, while he had this sort of reputation in the press, which he partly owned, of being a very generous boss, the conditions of his workers were pretty awful. For example, the tramway workers worked 365 days a year. They did not get a single day off. And across his entire sort of business empire, he kept a system of reserve staff. So if you applied for a job for him at any time, you were kept on this list so that people went on strike, or if people got sick, or if people died, you could immediately replace them. So he's a smart guy. This was a reserve army of scabs if a strike happened. The transport union is very intensive around recruiting among Murphy's employees at this time. They try to unionise the trams and also the newspapers. Murphy had this line that he said that any union but Larkin's, all these good unions won't cause trouble for me, basically, which is a sign of the sort of standout radical nature of the transport union at the time. And then into August, there's massive dismissals of union members among Murphy staff. Tram workers go out on strike in response. This spreads to the other sections of the sort of Murphy's business empire, and the idea of that like historical. Sorry.
Stop me if I'm asking too many questions. But, you mentioned that there was attempts to organize the media aspect of it as well. Like I know the NUJ was a thing at this point, and they were kind of gaining ground in England. But did they actually find any success in organising any newspapers?
So it was mostly in the printing, rather than the actual journalism.
Okay.
Yeah. And the distribution as well. Yeah, there's like this sort of war of rhetoric between the Transport Union and Murphy and his sort of buddies in the other newspapers, which results in Jim Larkin, James Connolly, who had become involved in the Transport Union at this time, or in 1910, I think, and a load of the other leaders of the union were arrested for sedition. Obviously, trumped up charges. They were released eventually before their sentences were up. But there was this sort of massive deployment of the police in the city. They brought in 4IC officers from outside the city as well. So, and they also deployed, they didn't deploy the British Army, but they instructed them to stay in their uniforms in their barracks. So there was this very real sense that something was going to go very, not bad, but something was going to erupt and bad things would happen. Eventually, this sort of leads to Larkin is out, he's on the run. The police have banned any assemblies of the union. So in defiance of this, Larkin sneaks into a hotel on O'Connell Street, which is owned by William Martin Murphy. He's dressed up, he's wearing Constance Markovich's smock, and he goes up to the first floor onto a balcony and starts giving a speech. Immediately, chaos ensues. The police had been sort of loitering around the city waiting for something to happen. They knew something was going to happen, but because this speech wasn't like an announced speech, the union members weren't actually really there. It was just random people going about their day on O'Connell Street. But the police attack regardless. There's massive chaos. The police even start chasing people back to their homes in tenements and start beating people up, including women and children. There's over 200 arrested. Somewhere between 460 and 600 were hospitalised, and 2 workers were killed. This is sort of like the massive escalation by the police. And from this, there's the story, which is the event is now called Bloody Sunday, one of the many in Irish history, obviously. It becomes headlines across the world. It's a massive embarrassment for both Dublin Castle, but also for Murphy. This sort of ratchets up the tension even higher. Murphy and the Dublin Employers Federation start the lockout. Basically, it moves from just a strike to a lockout, and they sort of apply their pressure through the Employers Federation, similar to Cork and Wexford in the years before, and they give a very familiar ultimatum of leave the union and denounce it, or be blacklisted. So yeah, by September, over 20,000 workers in Dublin were locked out, and this sort of like moved the strategy of the employers to one of almost siege. They're trying to wait it out until the union's strike day was exhausted, and starve the workers until they gave up basically. There's also at this point mass evictions that happen for workers who could no longer pay their rent. It started in October. This is also the point at which the Citizens Army is organised, initially as sort of the Citizens Army that went on to participate in the Easter Rising. Sort of initially as just a guard for workers on pickets, but it's sort of popularly known as the first Red Guard or Red Army in Europe. But they didn't really see action during the lockdown anyway. They weren't armed, but it was sort of a morale boost for the workers on strike. The sort of stumbling block of the lockout was going quite strong before this, but because of the distress of the children of the family of workers who were starting to experience starvation, the union had this idea of sending the kids to trade unionists in England to sort of lighten the burden on the striking parents and on the union. Church got a hold of this instead of having concern for starving children. They came out with this line that these socialists are sending our children to Protestant England to try to convert them, which was obviously not the plan. So eventually the church starts to denounce this in protest. James Connolly, who was running the union because Larkin was in jail again. No, sorry. It basically works to cow the union. Larkin is arrested, and then Connolly, who had never been really a big fan of the plan anyway, scrapped it while Larkin was in jail. And for a week after that, he suspended the soup kitchen in Liberty Hall and sort of told the bishop, if you care so much, then you can feed the working population of Dublin, which they obviously didn't, but it sort of illustrated the point, because all of these people had to go to charitable soup kitchens that were sort of mostly run by the church anyway, and completely overwhelmed those services. The Save the Kiddies plan. Got a socialist shark under here trying to get the Irish kids, but thankfully there's a priest there to save the kids. Hasn't aged very well. So eventually the sort of reaction to the Save the Kiddies campaign sort of gives the Employers Federation cover. All this media attention was on this, the sort of outrage of that, and allowed them to sort of sneak some scabs in, start breaking the strikes. There was also Connolly and Larkin and many other trade unionists had spent a lot of time in England and Scotland trying to lobby for simply strikes in Britain to sort of expand the struggle. And also to collect money for strike pay and for food and stuff like that. And while there were limited success in terms of, they organised the British Trade Union Congress paid for a ship of supplies to be sent to Dublin. Overwhelmingly, the sort of conservative, certainly in comparison to the Transport Union, the conservative leadership of the British unions, who were sort of fighting their own struggle against the sort of syndicalist, more radical trade unionists in their grassroots, sort of saw it as an extension of that sort of debate. So they said, no, we're not supporting. So, yeah, Brits, who would have thought? But it sort of gave the Irish unions this very stark lesson that if they wanted to take radical action, they couldn't rely on British unions for solidarity all the time. It's sort of mixed in terms of whether people view this as a victory or defeat. It was by far the sort of most powerful display of the power of workers in in Irish history. It made headlines across the world. It did all these things, but fundamentally, at the end of the day, the strike and the strike broke and the lockout won. So it's sort of, I think, best perceived as sort of a partial defeat, but a success in terms of the demonstrating the power of the organising strategy of the Transport Union and their sort of tactics of strikes and sympathetic strikes. And also just sort of expanding class consciousness among workers in Ireland. So there is, however, a period of demoralisation after it. Obviously, the union's coffers were basically empty, Larkin, who had really sort of led the strike, goes into this period of depression, and is eventually convinced that he should do a speaking tour in America to raise money for the union. So Larkin leaves in early 1914, and promptly spends most of his time in America in prison. But here we have sort of the owning class's idea of how the strike and the lockout went. In this period, directly following the lockout, the transport union sort of goes through a period of licking its wounds and recovering. Larkin is no longer around, so this kind of hot-headed figure who very much sort of tried to make the movement him to be the movement. With him out of the way, there's sort of a broader collection of people who are running things. Larkin is still General Secretary, but Connolly steps in as sort of acting, but essentially is the General Secretary at the time, and underwent this very gradual recovery from the lockout. The finances were a mess, so they reorganised that, and they also, in this period, along with the sort of development in Ireland as a whole, went through this period of sort of pivoting towards more anti-imperialist politics. But in terms of what was happening in the background, obviously, the First World War breaks out. This leads to a sort of very accelerated cycle of boom and bust initially, with all the industry that was being steered towards the war effort. There's massive money pumped into the manufacturing sector, which sort of brings more workplaces. But with all resources being directed into the war effort, stuff like food and concrete and building materials, means that there's massive inflation for working class people to buy all of these very essential stuff. So yeah, there's a boom in the shipbuilding, in munitions and textiles and food production. But again, this is focused mainly around the north, where the manufacturing centres are. Yeah, and then it's important to note as well that this sort of very rapid inflation was something that was completely new to most people. There hadn't been this kind of rapid inflation since the crash after the Napoleonic Wars. So this was new terrain for a lot of people, and obviously would lead a lot of people into taking action. Then, of course, there's the shortage of manpower from everyone who has to go fight Britain's war for them. This also puts pressure on food production because people are taken from the countryside. Eventually, there's this push towards tillage to sort of shore up the food supply. But what this ends up doing is flooding workers back into the countryside, which makes them a lot more valuable to employers. So they're sort of more willing to accede to union demands. And then, very important as well, is the Third Home Rule Bill and partition. So there was this bill just before the First World War to give Ireland home rule, basically, which would give it limited self-government. This is passed eventually in early 1914, I believe. I should have that. But when the war breaks out, the British government sort of promise that they'll enact it, but after the war. So it sort of kept as this carrot on the stick for the Irish parliamentarians. It also results in the Curragh Mutiny, which was a mutiny of the British Army, which refused to move against Unionists, basically, who had recently founded the UDF, the paramilitary force. And basically this sort of ensured that a promise was given to Unionists that the North would be excluded from Home Rule. So this is sort of the setting of the seeds for partition, which would be sort of made official many years later. I'm not going to explain the Easter Rising because people generally know what it is. Very familiar story to us. The importance for this talk here is that there was very central involvement by the Citizens' Army, which at this point was sort of the paramilitary wing of the trade union movement. And Connolly is very central to the planning and execution of the Rising. So, yeah, this sort of like spouted from this split in the workers' movement across Europe in reaction to the First World War, where the majority of socialist movements and with them trade unions sort of went in behind their own country's war efforts. Many saw this as massive betrayal of working class solidarity, where in fact these movements were supporting workers fighting other workers instead of fighting against the real enemy, which are the owners. Yeah, so Connolly gets particularly frustrated with this, sees continuous inaction across Europe from socialist movements and from trade unions, and sort of he had this plan to have an uprising because he believed that the Irish volunteers wouldn't rise in time, but is kidnapped. It depends on who you ask, but he was probably kidnapped by Patrick Pearse and some other members of the IRB, and basically brought into a new plan of Easter 1916 will have the rising.
Was there disagreement within the ICA as to whether or not to go ahead with the Rising? Because I know that there is a good bit of disagreement within the ITGW itself.
I don't know in terms of the ICA, but definitely, as you can see in that spoiler, trade unions were not supportive. So yeah, the rising happens. The leaders are arrested, and Connolly and Michael Mallon, who is also a trade unionist, are executed by the British. Bad day. However, the trade union of which Connolly had been general secretary and organizer with for several years didn't even call for the reprieve of Connolly's execution. Another interesting fact is that William Martin Murphy's newspaper, and the newspapers in general even, called for executions up until the time Connolly was shot. Then they were like, we can stop now. So they obviously viewed trade unions as the bigger threat, even in the sort of context of a Republican-led uprising. Liberty Hall is bombed by the British gunship, which is it the Odd?
No,
The Helga.
The oil was the one that ran the guns down.
Yeah. So this leaves the Union in a bit of a pickle in many ways. Primarily, they wanted to distance themselves from the Easter Rising and from Connolly. So it's sort of like indicative of this much more cautious, much more moderate group of people who take control of the Union, when Connolly and a lot of the sort of more radical trade union members were killed or imprisoned after the Rising. But they would go on to claim Connolly sort of like 1918. They had sort of agreed that no, actually, we'll claim Connolly now in word, but their actions something different. We'll see later. There's also like the rising caused massive problems for the union, but there's also this idea that it saved the union, in that it sort of raised the prestige of trade unions and of socialists, and just the general situation of the rising as well caused much more militant action to be desired by workers. So another sort of recovery. So it was 30,000 members in 1913. Is that what it was? I think. By 1916, this is reduced a lot, but in the 2 years after that, they expand again massively. Yeah, larger than most British unions. Agricultural organising in this period takes off again. There's massive organising in Dublin County and in sort of southern, in Munster especially, where large tillage farming was happening, and where there was a bit of sort of industry as well in terms of creameries. So this was also a period where there was massive inflation as well, so it drove more people into the trade unions. This inflation also gave trade unions sort of like a broader, not like strictly economic in terms of wages platform, but the issue of food insecurity as well became a massive issue towards the end of the First World War. This also, this sort of like increase in union membership leads to a larger, more bureaucratized leadership, which sort of increases the problems of that we mentioned before, of the sort of like moderate bureaucrats who sort of wanted to build the union more than building the movement. So they were like concerned about strikes, meaning that they wouldn't have enough money in their coffers and stuff like that. But nonetheless, there's this massive increase in militancy. There's over 200 strikes a year in the period of 1918 to 1920. And the idea of food committees sort of becomes much more prevalent. There's a general strike. Since 1916, there had been conscription in Britain. It hadn't been brought into Ireland yet because they knew that it wouldn't be a good idea. But recruitment is dropping. Important to note that while recruitment was high in terms of numbers in Ireland, it was proportionally lower than any of the other sort of constituent parts of the UK. It stayed low and it got lower as the war went on. So facing, this is 1918, we think of it as sort of near the end of the war, but it was really a surprise to a lot of people when the war did end. There was a massive German offensive in the spring, so there's massive need to replace manpower. So Britain eventually decides to extend conscription to Ireland to sort of, to bring in that untapped resource of manpower. This results in sort of like a massive movement against it. It was basically entirely unpopular, but it was the workers' movement which was really the sort of deciding aspect of it. So the Irish Trade Union Congress decides to hold a one-day strike. It's the first general strike in Irish history, so a general strike. Who wants to tell me what a general strike is?
Everyone does it.
Yeah. Shut down the entire economy. Sort of the most powerful display of what trade unions could do in normal circumstances. It's the first one in Irish history. There's several over the next few years, and then there are none. We haven't had one since, I think, 1923, which is crazy. Because food distress was quite high across the country, while this was just a one-day strike, trade unions locally took over food distribution. There's this massive sort of demonstration of sort of like a training as well for revolution in a way, of workers taking over, even if it is just for one day. But the effect was so powerful that the Brits decided to shelve conscription. They don't cancel it, but eventually they don't need it because the war ends. But it was so unanimously unpopular that many employers even paid their striking workers, which is a very rare occurrence. um, and yeah, this is also in the sort of wake of the radical wave that was sweeping Europe following or towards the end of the First World War, and the language that the Transport Union were using was very much in the mold of sort of workers' Soviets or congresses and stuff like that. We'll get onto Soviets a bit later, but kind of means a bit something a bit different in Ireland. To note actually on the general strike as well that while it was a national general strike, there wasn't as much pickup in Ulster around it. There were massive marches, but strikes didn't occur. And Thomas Johnson, who was leader of the Labour Party at the time, which was aligned with the Trade Union Congress, had his head split open by a brick by loyalists when marching. So we're sort of starting to see this something that obviously existed for many years, but the split within the workers' movement due to sectarianism. And sort of after this, the Southern Union leadership sort of holds Ulster at arm's length, and it sort of progressively gets worse in terms of not really knowing what to do or wanting to sort of find out what should be done in terms of Ulster. So yeah, the war ends and a general election is called. The leadership of the trade unions is convinced to step aside in the election to sort of make it a Republican versus Unionist, almost like a referendum. The Labour Party agrees, basically just leaves the way for the sort of more middle class element in Irish society to take all of the seats. Also in this period, and sort of like indicative of this Labour must wait kind of mentality, is sort of abdication of any kind of vision for what Ireland should be, especially in this sort of process of anti-imperial struggle. You know, when revolutions were sweeping across Europe, Irish unions hesitated. There wasn't any real vision presented by the leadership, so this sort of left it up to the grassroots to look after. Also worth noting the democratic programme, the First All, which was sort of given to the unions in appreciation for not standing. It's sort of dismissed as mostly poetry by a very conservative member of the Dáil. It was sort of important to those who believed in it, but could be easily dismissed by those who didn't. So the sort of effect of Labour on this process is very muted. We move into a sort of real sort of revolutionary period here, where in January 1919, following the elections, where Sinn Féin gains a landslide majority, they convene the First Dáil, declare independence, and it's also the day on which the first shots are fired of the War of Independence. That's kind of disputed, but it's a handy marker. But only 3 days later, something called the Monaghan Asylum in Soviet happened. So this is the first workplace occupation of its kind in Ireland. Like just a simple escalation of a strike tactic in some ways, but it also indicated a more broad revolutionary political ambition by grassroots union members. And between 1919 and 1920, over 100 of these happened, and more happened even later. So there's this massive movement of Soviets and workplace occupations. We just started talking about this just in terms of it being the beginning, and it's a success as well. Results in victory. The workers had been working 93-hour weeks beforehand, and they won a 56-hour week, so pretty good. Next is the Limerick Soviet, much more famous than any of the others, really. This is sort of much more of a mixed experience. The it's triggered really by the murder of a Irish Republican Army member and a trade union activist, which at his funeral, there's an attempt to sort of ban it by the Brits, and then sensing this sort of sense of revolt in the city, the British authorities instituted a lockdown, a military lockdown, and in response, trade unions strike and sort of decide really to just kind of take over the city centre. So they established like a Soviet or a strike committee, I think it's they called it. Also starts issuing currency. We've got little copies of it here. So there's like a very ambitious sort of basically seizure of an entire city. However, it is done with the support of Sinn Féin and some business owners. So when it comes to it, to the sort of wrapping up of it, the sort of conservative trade union officials are able to apply pressure along with the Republicans and with the business owners to shut it down. And in fact, the trade union leadership basically ordered it to be shut down, despite the fact that 15,000 people had been on strike in total. So it's sort of a taste of the things to come for that. In terms of what's happening in Ulster at the time, you have something called the Belfast engineering strike for a 44-hour week. Ulster or Belfast was home to the largest shipyards in the world, but importantly, what you don't see here is a Soviet. It's a strike. There isn't sort of like a wider ambition to take over the workplace. They did take control of electricity, gas, and water, but there wasn't any attempt to sort of extend it beyond that. It also sort of results in giving unionist leadership, who had been very careful around these kind of things for fear of alienating their working class base, of sort of increasing the attraction of trade unions to them. The defeat of this essentially gives unionists the upper hand in that, and the result of that in the years to come, in 1920, the unionist leadership is basically enabled to encourage the expulsion of Catholics and socialists and trade unionists from the dockyards in Belfast, resulting in the expulsion of, we're not totally sure, I found conflicting numbers about this, but 7,500 to 12,000 trade unionists, both Protestant and Catholic, from the shipyards. So, yeah, there's sort of the very clear result of the trade union movement in the south ignoring, essentially, the trade union movement in the north. It gives unionists this vacuum which they can take control of. Increasingly into the War of Independence, the actions of the trade union movement become slightly more radical. So there's a general strike, another one called in 1920 for the release of hunger strikers. It is very successful. In this general strike, there was also workers took over local city halls and distributed food from it. This also triggers the Waterford Soviet, which itself caused the Sinn Féin mayor of the town to basically step aside, and the workers' council governed instead. Again, they took over food supply and distribution. Police basically surrendered the town centre. They couldn't control anything, and it was only dissolved when it was announced that the hunger strikers would be released. So there's sort of like building ambition within parts of the trade union movement, are building up. there's also the railway workers boycott, which is sort of only a temporary thing. If you've seen The One That Shakes the Barley, there's a scene in that where Liam Cunningham's character refuses to transport British soldiers. That's kind of the gist of it. The railway workers basically refused to handle the transport of munitions, vehicles, or British soldiers for the British Army. Yeah, and then the Soviet movement itself is constantly expanding within this context, basically exclusively with like local grassroots organizers.
Do you know, were they called Soviets at the time, or did that come afterwards?
Yeah, some of them were. Like the Monaghan one wasn't actually described as a Soviet by them, but like Limerick was. We have there's a few pictures as well of a bakery with a sign calling itself a Soviet. So it was kind of mixed. Obviously, it wasn't like super clear what Soviets were, and like what they sort of perceived Soviets to be compared to what it was in the Soviet or the Russian context. But it was sort of like consciously sort of aping that sort of revolutionary language. You also see in this period the farmers unionizing. So the owners of the big farms. I actually didn't know this before researching this as well, but they actually founded a paramilitary organization called the Farmers Freedom Force. And in response, agricultural workers set up their own Red Guards to stop the Farmers Freedom Force from breaking strikes.
What was the bulk of the FFF? Like if you have a case where like it's the big farm owners that are forming it, like are they just forming a paramilitary out of scabs, or is it the MASH themselves doing it, or how does it actually work?
I presume so. Like this is something that I only saw referenced in like a sentence. I'd definitely like to look into it more, but I imagine it's something like that, yeah. Yeah, we're moving now into the fun time when the good guys lose. And yeah, so just the picture there, we'll talk about it a bit later, but it's the Irish Postal Workers strike in 1922, sort of still during the Civil War, but the army is deployed, the National Army, the pro-treaty army is deployed to fire upon workers on strike. So I just really like this poster. Well done to PvP for that. So again, more Soviets. They're fucking everywhere. The Cork Harbour Soviet starts in 1921. It's more of sort of a strike than a Soviet really, but they do raise the red flag. They do all the stuff of taking control over the docks and not bringing people without their own permission in. And the Cork Harbour Soviet ends partially because the Republicans who controlled City Hall at the time sort of convinced the union to go into conciliation talks with the employers. So this is something we see a bit more as well as the sort of underground revolutionary government of Sinn Féin expands. It has more sort of administration capacities where it can, especially the Labour Department, which is run by Constance Markovich, increasingly tries to sort of moderate strikes and to bring them to agreement in the belief that we can fight this out once the Brits are gone or once the Civil War is over, etc. So yeah, and then in terms of housing, because we love housing here, the Galway Soviet, I haven't heard about this as well, but in May 1922 it was this revolt basically about rip-off rents in Galway in the city centre and the lack of affordable housing, and it was dubbed the Galway Soviet. It wasn't really a Soviet compared to the other ones, but it was organised by the Galway Town Tenants League, and it was sort of very consciously them trying to expand the sort of winds and the ideas of the land war into an urban environment. They also teared down the statue of Lord Drumkellan. They never put up again, which is great. And they took over the council chambers and demanded public housing. But it wasn't a great success. And then Limerick in the same year, not a Soviet, but the Limerick Workers Housing Association took over 27 vacant homes in Garryowen and occupied them for 9 months. So there's this sort of aspect to it as well of housing activism throughout this. And then the Munster Soviet was basically just hundreds of creameries across Munster were eventually taken over by workers and run by workers as well. So they were selling butter and other products to selling it to the market and stuff like that. And eventually that too was shut down. This time, sort of during the Civil War, the National Army again, the pro-treaty army, shuts down the strike basically, and also the trade union leadership was trying to shut it down as well. Basic background: in December 1921, a treaty is signed between the Sinn Féin government and the Brits. It's formalised the partition and brings in an oath of allegiance that all members of the Dáil are to swear to the King initially, but I think they changed it to the Lord Lieutenant or whatever else they're called. The treaty also put massive crippling debts on the new 26 County Ireland. So as also the repayment of loans given to tenants during the land reform process, and cumulatively these two amounted to a higher proportionate amount of the Irish GDP than the German reparations after World War One.
Just because you mentioned Pat O'Donnell earlier on, I don't know if this is in your notes, but the land community campaign was basically to tell the Brits to fuck off. About that was a campaign that he ran very successfully, and then became essentially like one of the main election platforms for Fianna Fáil when they first came into government.
Yeah.
There Will Be Another Day is a kind of memoir of that, which I think we have up there. But it is very, very good. I know Michael, like the captain, like the organizer, Michael Sheehan, says it's like one of the best organising books he's read this year.
Yeah, it's kind of beyond the scope of this, but definitely
All right.
bear in mind. So these massive crippling debts basically are put on the new Irish state. Trade unions basically decide, or the trade union leadership rather, decides not to take a side in the eventual civil war that splits, that emerges. So basically just guarantees their irrelevance in this whole thing and their powerlessness. They have this kind of token general strike against militarism just after Republicans take over the forecourts. It's not very clear what they were asking of whom in that strike, but there was this sort of feeling of sort of hopelessness among many of the sort of grassroots organisers in the union about the course of the workers' movement in this. Yeah, so the Labour Party runs in the 1922 election, 21 election, 22 elections, I think. Sorry. And they accept to take their seats in this new parliament, which Republicans refuse to. They also accept to take the Pledge of Allegiance. So pretty problematic for a workers' movement to be doing such a thing. Yeah. Again, I feel like I'm just heading into more and more fatalistic stuff here, but there'll be a nice ending when it's coming soon. So between the Civil War and the international economic situation after the First World War, there's massive economic collapse. By December 21, Irish manufacturing had halved, and 26% of workers were idling. James Larkin eventually returns in 1923 and immediately, with his still massive ego, proceeds to split the trade union movement. This and the economic situation generally causes union membership to collapse, basically, So in 1922 there was 100,000 in the transport union. In 1925 there were 51,000, and in 1929 that had dropped to 15,000. Well, during sort of the Civil War period, and even after it, the army was increasingly used to shut down strikes, and because of the economic situation, employers had much more power to reduce wages. So there's this massive collapse. It's pretty shit. Loads of people immigrate, and yeah, basically like in certain parts of the sort of history on this, it's referred to as a counter-revolution. I think definitely it's a good way of describing it. Partly, on the part of the new Free State government, and obviously the government in the north, but also the sort of betrayal of the trade union leadership of what was essentially a revolutionary situation. There was people had more hope than I ever had of overthrowing capitalism. Yeah. It's kind of a shitty conclusion, but that's the conclusion of the historic part. In terms of sort of what this period teaches us, it's like there's like specific things about like for tenants union and stuff like that in terms of focus on recruitment and sort of building up so that you can do big shit like a rent strike, and yeah, like increasingly we're seeing property being concentrated into smaller and smaller hands, so stuff like the rates, the investment funds and stuff like that. Yeah, so that's sort of very specific thing, but in general, like I think this whole period kind of teaches us that movements can't just have this very narrow economic focus of like getting a rent cap or enforcing rent caps even, or building more public housing. Like fundamentally, a union like CATU is here at the end of the day to end landlordism. That's what I think anyway. CATU does call for universal public housing, which is kind of like a phrase that's thrown around a lot, but it does essentially mean the end of private rental for housing. Which I think is class and would be cool. But also, yeah, like because of these, we should never lose touch with the sort of radical tradition of Irish history, which isn't just history, but it is sort of, it's not just history. It's how people have struggled in Ireland before. It's been done before. It can be done again. We can't play like second fiddle to like reformist movements or like conservative movements. We have to have like an independent vision for how to end landlordism, basically. Yeah, but there's this idea that Ireland is this backwards place, that ideas come slowly to Ireland. But that's not really true, as evidenced by this whole period. Ireland was sort of at the forefront of trade union movement, of class struggle through this period, in a way that is completely hidden from us, almost as if by design. Yeah, basically, that is it. Does anyone else have anything to add for Leland?
Just two things. Firstly, great job on drawing attention to a few. I mean, I don't think a lot of people know about this in general, but you know, I'm a massive labour history nerd. I didn't even know about the court lockout. The other thing is to add to the radicalism of the ITGWU and their successes, the OBU, that statistic of them having 110,000 members in December 1918, there was massive unemployment that month, and if you didn't pay your fees or you became unemployed 1 month, you were no longer a member, you were no longer considered a member. So they actually would have had more supporters or more members in the months beforehand, and they only took stock of the amount of members they had once a year in the December conferences. So that's like a lowball number. And in the ITUC, the second biggest union would have been the National Union of Railwaymen, who only had 10,000 members. So they're kind of blowing everybody else out of the water. So it's probably the most successful OBU in the world, really, like even more so than in the US with what are they
The-
called? The
IWW.
Yeah, IWW. So yeah, that's
Supposed to put my communist hat on for a moment. The like especially during the looking at the war of independence and looking at the effects that those general strikes had, like the railway strike and the inability of British troops for what about 8 months of the year they were unable to move troops across a lot of the island, which at the time was one of the most heavily railwayed islands on the world. It was the main source of logistical travel, and they just weren't able to do it. And it sort of hammers home this idea that, like, yes, you have groups like the IRA that were very effective guerrilla movements, and they did to a certain extent beat one of the largest kind of empires in the world. But they weren't able to do that. They wouldn't have been able to do that unless they could mobilize massive amounts of workers. And so the years and years of development of these mass movements before a single shot was fired, it essentially like Solo had Vegan and the kind of the ensuing conflict could have very easily just turned into a second Easter Rising had there not been a massive sort of mass movement of workers, and then also as like we can see with like Galway and Limerick kind of independent struggle with this just general sort of working class consciousness and working class organization, you know. Communist hat now.
So yeah, that's the end of the presentation. If anyone has questions, they can ask, I guess. I don't know if I'll have an answer, but
What was the main secret?
the main secret.
Yeah, started secret revolution.
Uh,
That's what you didn't know about.
Yeah.
yeah, did I not communicate that well?
I thought that was pretty clear.
You're just being facetious.
Yeah, workers are class. That's the secret.
No, it's okay. Do you know anything more? Did you say it was a Galway Association of like tenants and workers or something that were built in the Galway Soviet? Do you know anything else about that organization?
It was run by a member of the Transport Union, so I was very closely associated with them. That's kind of all I know. Margaret?
Yeah, they, as well as not teaching us about those things that you brought up, and it was marvellous, the list of stuff that you had. I think when they do tell us, they say there were some missed strike days in 1960, whatever.
Yeah.
But that was a bad thing because it affected industry, and that's the way they present it. So you don't really look for more after hearing that, especially if you're a young student. You're not going in as a student of very mature years.
Yeah.
So it's very important what you're doing, and the fact that you put it online, I think, is great.
Yeah, I think, like, just to riff off that as well, like when it is taught in schools, like the 1930 rocket or for change economy, it's always like, oh, you know, they were fighting for workers' rights. It's very limited, like, oh,
Yeah.
you know, they wanted to be paid more, that's it. Like,
Yeah.
it's just such a limited way of looking at it.
I have a more serious question. Is there any reflections in the modern trade union movement in Ireland that were inherited from the kind of counter-revolution and betrayal of the workers back then?
Well, yeah, like the whole idea of like conciliation has been sort of like the modus operandi of the trade union movement.
Conciliation, sorry, was it?
Talking to bosses and working it out rather than sort of using the power of strikes or anything like that. The trade union movement, or the leadership of like SIP2, which is what evolved out of the transport union, unfortunately, was supportive of the passing of the Industrial Relations Act, which bans political strikes. So stuff like the Dunn's anti-apartheid strikes couldn't happen today; they'd be illegal. It's important to remember that in the early days, unions like the Transport Union, there were no laws around this kind of thing. Really, what they were doing was illegal, and that's how they got things done. I'll do that there. Yeah, but yeah, just a very like conservative, like bureaucratic kind of like mindset around unions is definitely still in today. But they all still claim Conley. Yeah.
I think what you said about the politicization of unions is really interesting because what made the ITGW so successful and the ITUC especially is adopting a political program in 1918 and hitching their wagon to independence to some degree. And I think a few unions might be able to learn from inserting themselves into politics again, like getting rid of the Industrial Relations Act and things like that. And seeing as how we're doing the what can be learned section, what do you think TATU could possibly learn from that?
I think, like, obviously we're a very small union, so there isn't really a bureaucracy there, but it's always a danger when the union does grow. So that's very important. Like, just, I guess, going out and doing shit. Even if you fail, like the court lockout was in some ways kind of like doomed to fail, but it's through doing that you build a union's experience and militancy. Yeah, I don't know. Does anyone else have thoughts?
How do you think the bureaucracy affected the union or like engagement with members? Do you think it lowered engagement with members, or do you think it
In the trade unions?
in trade unions? Yeah.
Yeah, like it took the power out of their hands. Like during, like I'm not like advocating no structure or anything like that. Obviously, people do need to be like assigned to do jobs and stuff. But I forgot the question. Sorry, I've been speaking a long time.
Well, how do you think the bureaucracy that came about, especially under like William O'Brien, affected the efficacy of the union, its ability to actually achieve revolution and also wins for the working class in the short term?
Negatively.
Yeah. Fair enough.
Yeah, I suppose following up, like William O'Brien and that, and full-time officials today, particularly at a senior level, their interest is in holding the structure of the union and the finance there, which would excuse them, a level of pay that's way superior to the people they're working. So they have just that contradiction. They must be seen to be representing the workers, but at the same time, they're protecting the union as such, or for their own interests as such. And I don't know, there was somebody here the other night when Pride was shown, some people anyway. But I mentioned at the time when the Thatcher government sequestered the funds of the NUM, there was actually people from here going to England with suitcases full of actual cash, before there was the electronic scanners in airports and before we could transfer money. Yeah, so again, that's, and the 1990 Industrial Relations Act does that. If you put your foot wrong in relation to what's seen as a political fight, but your funds can be taken, and the top level of the bureaucrats do not want that. So it's, yeah. And the other thing, sorry, it's just the thing, in 1913, when there was the plan or whatever to send kids over to England, and just before the miners' strike collapsed, there was the same thing about to happen, where kids from mining communities would be, brought here in other countries. And I remember at the time it was a big issue in the Cochrane Council of Trade Unions that we were kind of repaying the debt of 1913 that never materialised, but yes, British-based trade unions were willing to make an engagement.
Interesting. Should probably wrap it up there. Thanks.